doing the Washington launch of Alan William Wolff's new book, Revitalizing the World Trading System. I'm holding it up. I'm going to say its title 3 times. You should buy it. Revitalizing the World Trading System, published by Cambridge University Press. We've been very fortunate to have Alan Wolff with us as a distinguished visiting fellow since he completed his service as first Deputy Director General and then Acting Director General of the World Trade Organization. Alan had been, he's of course Ambassador Alan William Wolff, was a trade negotiator, a practitioner as a lawyer, a policy analyst. He was on the advisory panel of the Institute for many, many years and was called by many the dean of the trade bar in Washington. I know many alumni of some of his firms who cut their teeth working for him and gone on to also distinguished careers. Alan, I think, surprised us all in a wonderful way by his leadership at the WTO in a period when the sitting U.S. Trade Representative at the time and the person who appointed him or nominated him for appointment was basically attacking some of the principles on which the organization was founded and functioned. And he has continued to be an advocate for international law, multilateralism, and freer trade here at Peterson, speaking globally, when that person's successor as U.S. Trade Representative has continued the attacks and the discussion in a not very multilateral way. Alan is not here to throw stones at other practitioners, but it is important to recognize that revitalizing the world trading system is both a principled and a topical, highly relevant volume for today. And so we are very proud to have Alan with us, Alan's wife, Reverend Ellen Wolff, and friends and colleagues around the world, both in person and online. This book was already presented at the WTO in Geneva, and we're very glad to be doing the Washington launch. With that, I also want to introduce another longtime friend and colleague of Alan's and of the Institute, Professor Jennifer Hillman. She is a professor of the practice at Georgetown University Law Center and co-director there of its Center on Inclusive Trade and Development. She's also a senior fellow for trade and international political economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. I would recommend to all of you, in addition to Alan's book, a new publication co-authored by Jennifer and Inu Manak on global subsidies policy, which came out recently, which I think is superb and which complements nicely some of the arguments that Alan makes in this book. So I'm going to call on Alan to present the book, and then Jennifer and Alan will have an illuminating and constructive discussion about revitalizing the world trading system. Thank you, Alan.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here this morning at this podium where I've stood before. This time to talk about my book, which Adam held up. And I urge you to make this Christmas presents to all of your friends and relatives, but actually to recommend this to those who are teaching, because it's the next generation, particularly, that I want to reach. I want to thank the Peterson Institute for the support it's given me during the writing of this book, and for hosting on its website over 50 articles of mine, consisting of short and not so short essays on trade topics, ranging from my address at Glasgow University in June on the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith, and to an essay co-written with Warren Moriyama on how the WTO might best deal with issues of national security. This podium was occupied 8 days ago in celebration of Dick Cooper's life. Dick Cooper and Fred Bergson were colleagues of mine, all of us sub-cabinet level officials in the Carter administration. And then, as Adam said, I came here and was on the advisory committee of what was then the Institute for International Economics before Pete Peterson came along with his support. It's a continuing honor to be affiliated with the Institute today, but more important, benefiting from the continued intellectual exchange with my colleagues, the Institute's fellows, which is really a major reason for being at the Institute. Dick Cooper wrote an article in Foreign Policy in 1972 saying that the title of it was Trade Policy is Foreign Policy. Larry Summers cited it in his remarks. I had not come across it before. It's more true today than it's ever been in the past, and there's a clear cause for concern. My book is about the world trading system that America's enlightened foreign economic policy created, and the need for that system to be made equal to the major challenges facing the world today, whether it is climate change, something Jennifer spends a lot of time on in the world trading systems dealing with the challenges of climate change, future pandemics, which we are told will recur, and the impact of continuing technological advances, including artificial intelligence. The World Trading System stands for the proposition that international cooperation based upon both the rule of law and on sound economic principles is essential to the future well-being and prosperity of the people of our country and other countries. We are linked to other nations by this common interest. When I left the WTO in March of 2021, I was intent upon writing a guidebook to the institution. What I had in mind was the kind of book I would have liked to have had when I came over to the WTO in the summer of 2017. It was not that I was unfamiliar with the trading system. I'd been in it for 50 years, one way or another. One way was, as Jennifer was, chief legal officer for the administration in the United States. So I'd spent a lot of time on trade law and trade negotiations. But despite all of this experience, one cannot know all of the aspects of the institution, the WTO. And even those ambassadors in Geneva can't follow everything that's going on very readily. So my idea was, behind the motivation for this book, if more people, more students, more officials understood what the WTO stood for, how it worked, where it did not work, and knew about where the rule book had gaps, there would be a sound foundation for making improvements in the organization, and therefore improve the functioning of the world trading system. What's in the book? Well, it starts out with a chapter on the origins of trade, which was a great deal of fun to write, actually, because trade, it turns out, predated our species, Homo sapiens. How do they know that? In the archaeological record, the rare earth of 100,000 years ago, the equivalent of rare earth, was obsidian. And obsidian wasn't located every place, nor was there the ability to make tools out of obsidian every place. So both processing and the raw material had to go from one place to another, trade. And that was before our species existed. The bit later on, actually a lot later on, some 5,000 years ago, writing may have been invented in order to facilitate trade, because the clay tablets found in Mesopotamia are often about goods. To have long distance communication with those who were receiving goods as to how they were to be disposed. And the story of trade continues with Arab traders not being in the desert where you think they would belong, but actually following the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean to become traders over the ocean. And there were and the Silk Road was, of course, built with a Great Wall. So trade connected the planet. The lesson here is that trade occurs for a variety of reasons. Amber was prized for as sort of a semi-precious gem, and we can tell that by the fact that Tutankhamun has an amber part of his necklace when his grave was excavated. It doesn't occur in Egypt. It had to be traded. So the book starts with why trade takes place, when it takes place, and it goes back to then to the prehistory of the WTO, the GATT era, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the vision before that of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill meeting in Placentia Bay in August of 1941, who had an ideal view of what would follow the Second World War. Now, the U.S. was not yet a combatant, so it's quite something that they sat there and they said, what we want is equal access to markets and equal access to supplies. And that was the founding principle for the World Trading System. I appear in the book from time to time in footnotes, sort of flitting in and out of various issues. I defended U.S. interests of the GATT when the U.S. Balance of payments problems and the currency misalignment was causing the U.S. to be in enormous difficulty. We were running out of gold, and so an import surcharge was put into place. And this fellow, Bill Rehnquist, came over one Sunday at Treasury and approved the proclamation I was drafting. So here and there, I end up having a role in the background of some of the trade issues. I was present at the wrap-up, the attempted wrap-up of the Uruguay round in Brussels in 1990. Carla Hills was then the U.S. trade representative. I was with Mickey Cantor the early hours of the morning of the last day of the Uruguay round in 1993, the agreement that established the WTO. And I have a sense, a pretty good idea of what it was that the major countries negotiating at that time had in mind. The EU, Japan, Canada, the US, as some. What's become apparent in the intervening 28 years of the WTO's existence is that actually there's insufficient time, energy, and thought given to the establishment of the organization that was to supplant the GATT. And this job remains to be done. The next part of the book covers the history of progress within the WTO through 12 ministerial conferences. Many were dubbed in reports of the time as failure. At MC11, where I was a deputy director general, it was also termed a failure, and I think the absolute opposite was the case. The joint statement initiatives, the ability to get together like-minded countries to negotiate and agree to expand the World Trading System's rules was launched at Buenos Aires in December 2017, excuse me. It illuminated a path forward, how we're going to deal with climate change, with other environmental causes, which are under discussion actively at the WTO today. Most of the work of the WTO is not about litigation, although that's a subject that's covered very heavily in the press. And it's not about ministerial conferences, it's about committee work. And what I did in this book was place you, the reader, in in committee meetings. For example, the most important event, probably in the entire history of the 28-year WTO era, was the accession of China to the WTO. So I put you in the working party, listened to the discussion, and it's still quite relevant today. And I did that for the standards work as well. And standards can actually be quite interesting when you get into it. It's things like how long the Chinese representative said to the European Union representative, should you have a judgment of whether a driver is falling asleep at the wheel before an automatic system kicks in and is the standard one that will prevent trade or slow it down, or is it a standard that makes sense and is based on international principles? Lastly, I address, or just prior to lastly, I address some subjects in great detail because they require it: dispute settlement, agriculture, services, e-commerce, and development. And then lastly, I talk about reforms, what is needed in the institutional framework of the WTO to be able to solve current and future issues of great importance to the global economic system. My conclusions from the history that I put forward is it took some 50 years before, in the world trading system, before, this was the GATT era, before the WTO was founded. And in 1998, the heads of state and leaders from many countries, Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Jacques Santé for the EU, and a dozen others, came together in Geneva to celebrate GATT and to express their hopes for the future. This is the Diamond Jubilee year of the WTO, and you wouldn't know it. Doug Irwin did do a piece on it and did a presentation, but no head of state showed up in Geneva to say, isn't it great that there's been 75 years of the world trading system at this point? It was unremarked. And why is that the case? There are substantial concerns about the effectiveness of the WTO, the future direction it should take. Members talk of WTO reform. Mainly what they mean by WTO reform is most members restore the appellate body, the appellate level of dispute settlement. And the cover of this book, the reason I carried this to the podium, is this picture is on December 10th, 2019. It has a wintry sun, and the WTO wall is in somewhat wintry darkness. And it was the last day of the appellate body's existence because the U.S. blocked nominations to it. So binding dispute settlement, what did binding mean? Binding means final adjudication. But the binding nature of dispute settlement for all members of the WTO ceased to exist on the day that picture was taken. It was viewed by many as the jewel in the crown, not something I felt was the appropriate appellation, because the crown that's important, the WTO, rather than just dispute settlement. But I believe there's a path forward to solving the problem. I believe that there could be an interim arrangement. The EU has shown the way forward in what was considered a provocation by the United States when it was tabled. But the EU has shown a way forward to have an agreement that takes into account the concerns of the United States, which have been stated often. And I think the U.S. could join a binding dispute settlement system. And we can talk more about that in the discussion after these remarks. What I would start with is for the members to instruct the Director General that you cannot accept, unless we instruct you that you can accept, you cannot continue to accept appeals to a non-existent body. The appellate body doesn't exist, hasn't for 4 years, it's going to be 5 years. You all said, you members all said that you'd remedy this, you'd fix it. And if you have not, then appeals into the void, as it's called, appeals to a non-existent institution in order to warehouse some 30 cases and prevent them going to conclusion, that fraud will be ended. That's the only thing I can see that will trigger actually a negotiation to get something done, to put into place a new dispute settlement system. At least equally important in the WTO, like the GATT, it has to be a place where like-minded countries can come together and reach agreements on facilitating trade, and without any fear of that being blocked by non-participants. The path must be clear, whether it's for food security, future pandemics, meeting the trade rules for future pandemics, rules for digital commerce, whatever the subject is, those who are willing to go forward have to be able to go forward without a country or one or more countries standing up and saying, wait, we operate by consensus. And I say, no, that's unacceptable, has to stop. And actually, last week at another institution, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the WTO, said she's not supposed to take positions on anything, but on this, she takes the position. It has to stop. The third area of reform is to acknowledge the important role of the Director General and the Secretariat in shaping the agenda and driving progress. No institution of any size, including this one, is without an executive. The executive is sitting here, and he has a board, and Adam Posen is the president of this institution. And without an executive, no group of people coming together to go in a particular direction has a hope of ever making any progress. That is essential. You have to have order. You have to have vision. In the WTO, you have to have transparency. The WTO Secretariat has to assure that there is real transparency. I said to Arthur Dunkel years ago, why don't you buy a copy of why don't you subscribe to the Financial Times? Then you'd know what's going on in the world. And he said, I do subscribe, but the members won't let me read it. The members block the ability of the Secretariat to give full exposure to what's going on in world trade. And by that, I mean not just measures, but to look closely at places where there are trade anomalies. Where's trade not taking place? Or where is it taking place in excess? Just to understand what is moving goods and services around the world. Just compare the WTO to its sister institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, the ILO. All of them have an executive that sets the agenda, that chairs the local executive board, that puts proposals on the table. If Arthur Dunkel didn't put the GATT Director General years ago in the Uruguay round, didn't table what he thought the members could agree to, the contracting parties could agree to, there would be no WTO today. They needed a Director General who would push things forward. And Ngozi was chosen to be assertive. And actually, if you know her at all, she's pretty assertive. The Director General should engage in strategic foresight. The EU has strategic foresight. The Canadian government has strategic foresight. The WTO does not. It had a little experiment with it, but that didn't go anywhere. What does that mean? Identify the future challenges. You can look out the window and say, WTO has no air conditioning, by the way. And you could say, it's very hot in Geneva. Maybe something's going on in the world. That's strategic foresight. The book has a detailed discussion of reforms that I would see as necessary. What will the future hold? John McCain, a U.S. Senator, ran for president in 2008, quipped that it is always darkest before it turns pitch black. That's not why I'm here to say that it's impossible to make any changes like this, that fundamental changes in the world trading system. But there are threats. A presidential candidate who shall remain nameless here, not named today, but has said if reelected as president, he would impose an across the board tariff on all imports. Um, Basically, declaration of a trade war. And it would be U.S. renunciation of all of its international obligations in trade, period. That's it. End of story. And if you think that we would have alliances left and that there wouldn't be a response from our trading partners, I think that that would be to make a real mistake. We have to be a nation that keeps its word. That's fundamental. I don't believe that that worst case scenario will take place, but in the movie Oppenheimer, which I recommend to you, I haven't seen Barbie yet, but I haven't seen Oppenheimer, that General Leslie Grove, who's the Army chief of the Manhattan Project, turns to Oppenheimer and he says, what do your scientists say about whether triggering an atom bomb in the atmosphere will cause a chain reaction that destroys the world? And he said, Oppenheimer responds, the chances are near zero. And Leslie Grove responds, I'd prefer that you just said zero. That's what we're up against with respect to playing with the destruction of the world trading system. Well, I didn't come to make Cassandra-like predictions about the trading system. In the year 2020, I was asked by the Saudi Arabian government, the host countries of that year's the presidency, held the presidency of the G20, to reflect on what the values, actually they wanted the principles of what are the principles we could all agree to in the WTO, that these were the principles the WTO stood for. And I instead actually, that triggered the thought of what are the values of the WTO? What does it stand for? What's it do? You know, clearly the easiest to identify are non-discrimination and transparency, national treatment. But importantly, one of them is creating conditions for a durable peace. The WTO, really the ITO, the International Trade Organization, that didn't come into effect, the GATT did, was a peace project. It was designed to say, we've been through 2 world wars. This was in the 1940s. Been through 2 world wars. We've just been through a Great Depression in between the 2 wars. We don't want to do that again. We want to create a global economy that will give us a chance at a durable peace. Doesn't guarantee peace. And Larry Summers, standing here 8 days ago, said there's been no great power conflict, no war between great powers in the last 78 years. So it worked. It's not the only thing that did it, but because trade does not guarantee peace, but it makes it more possible, more durable. And its relevance today is for conflict-affected countries seeking to join the GATT, join the WTO. The Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Timor-Leste, they, in the last 2 in Liberia, Afghanistan, all have experienced in recent times, or are still experiencing, very major conflicts that they've been engaged in. If what they would say, like the president of Timor-Leste, Shoshana Guzmão, said, quite a moving address when he came to the WTO. He said, and he was the leader of the insurrection for independence against Indonesia. So here is the person who was in the battle, who then became president, and he said, where there's trade, there's peace. And you could believe it. He said, I want to raise the standard of living of my people. I want to increase the stability, which is what the opening words of the ITO Charter say, the Havana Charter, to create the stability, the economic progress, to allow there to be peace. So it's still a peace project, but it's not termed that way. It's not referred to that way, other than these countries that are conflict affected. In thinking about the remarks for this morning, and in conclusion, I came to a stark realization, which is we couldn't recreate this system today. Absolutely impossible. What countries would bind their tariffs and at what level? What countries would bind their domestic support levels for agriculture and at what level? Uh, the system we have, and this is my advice to the ministers who will meet in Abu Dhabi in February for the next ministerial conference, MC13, would be work to retain what you have without creating new exceptions. Repair what has been lost, not least binding dispute settlement. And third, build upon what you already have to meet emerging new challenges such as the trade aspects of climate change, food insecurity, because trade is essential to meeting the food insecurity challenge, future pandemics, where serious work is needed. We're not prepared in trade terms for the next pandemic. Didn't happen in this last go around. We had one good meeting in Geneva in the General Council where countries came in, we had a single subject, and they talked about their needs during the pandemic when they didn't have essential goods like masks or garments for hospital workers or first responders, and then ultimately vaccines. They didn't have them. How are you going to get them? Well, you're going to get them mainly through trade. Long-term investment, but short-term, medium-term trade. MC13 should try to achieve what it can, and it should set the path forward with a serious work program on other subjects. I hope that, as I said, this book will be used in universities to train the next generation. I hope that incoming junior officials will have it. It'll be supplanted, no doubt, by others in the future. But for the time being, it's sort of state of the art of what's this system about? How do you negotiate? Where'd trade come from? Why is it important? And to all work to value the system, preserve it, and improve it. With that, I thank you. And Professor Jennifer Hillman of Georgetown will join me for a discussion of these issues and to answer some questions. She's a very prolific author, and this morning I opened the mail and there was yet another publication, which Adam Posen mentioned, which was on subsidies. I didn't bring the larger piece of her work, which is immense and impressive on using trade tools to deal with climate change, which I look forward to reading, but it'll take about a year for me to get from here to there. So I'll be back. I'll be back to give it a review at that point. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning and thank you. It is a tremendous honor for me to be here. So I want to start by congratulating Alan on this marvelous, marvelous book. And I have already started assigning it to my own students, and I would hope that my colleagues out there that teach in this space would do likewise. I also want to thank Adam Posen and the Peterson Institute for giving me the honor of being part of this conversation. Your book is both a much needed history lesson on how we got here, and for me, it includes a very unique peek inside the doors of what is very much an opaque institution of the WTO, as well as a very thoughtful prescription on how we move forward, given the kind of near crisis state that we're in. I would note, for example, even just on Friday, the United States Trade Representative Catherine Tai reiterated the Biden administration's take that while for decades the U.S. has championed the international rules-based order and the multilateral trading system, that from her perspective, the functioning and the fairness of that order are now firmly in question. And it is worth debating where we are in this. So from my view, your book just could not come at a better time or offer from a more thoughtful or experienced author in this space. Your bottom line conclusion that the world trading system that exists today simply could not be replicated, nor could the WTO, means to me it is imperative that we fix the system, and that there's a real degree of urgency about it. So I'd like to start with one of the, I think, the sort of dangerous paths that it seems that we are on. Dr. Ngozi from the WTO has commented, and the WTO has put out a number of studies about this dangerous road. And when I speak of it, I mean a fragmentation of the world. And those studies would indicate that if we do not do something different, we are going to fragment into two basic trading blocks that will have the cost of reducing global GDP by as much as 5% every year, just from fragmenting the system that we now know. So what does the WTO do about that? I mean, how can the WTO contribute to moving us off of a path that could result in this bifurcating of the world?
Well, there are several ways in which is this now off? So we will try to be heard online as well. Apparently, an on switch is needed to communicate in this world. It's a standards issue in the trading system. The negotiations about pragmatism. It's an art that, and maybe a science that is partially lost, but not totally. And it's interesting. The WTO doesn't allow very readily for 164 countries to move forward in unison. So what happens? The Trade Facilitation Agreement was entered into. It is multi-speed. Countries designate what they feel they can do. They have to say, here's what we'll do on day one, or here's what we can do after some period of time for adjustment, or if you gave us some help, if you gave us some assistance, this is what we think we can do. So A, B, and C levels of obligation, and all signed up. They said, that's very good. We can do that. There was balance achieved in that area. And that template was applied to investment facilitation for development, where 110 countries, members of the WTO, said, not including the United States, this is not something the US particularly is enamored of, but it is something that we can follow that path of going at different rates of speed. It's essential that, as I said in my remarks, that whether it's climate change or the digital economy, e-commerce, that countries can come forward and say, this is what we feel we can do, and no one can say no. That no non-participant can say, that's not here. In the services area, the Trade and Services Agreement, there was an attempt to sort of take things across the street, and that didn't work out. I don't think that any minority can be allowed to block progress. It has to move forward. And I think it will in trade facilitation investment, and I hope that that will be to start to unlock the ability to reach agreements.
Well, it strikes me the way you just said, I mean, stems from the general consensus rule in the WTO that all decisions and all actions move only on the basis of consensus. And that consensus has become something that is so hard to achieve, both because of the number of members of the WTO and because of the ease it has become to simply raise the flag and say, I object, no consensus, without really having to state reasons why or what is the basis of the objection. There are provisions in the WTO rules that allow for voting in various scenarios, well spelled out. never used out of an assumption that, again, many countries would object to going to a voting. It's one country, one vote. So again, whether the United States would ever support that kind of a system, that's in the rules. But how do we deal with the fact that it has become so easy to block a consensus, at which point the system seems paralyzed?
My answer to that is very unlawyerly, which is just do it. Azevedo, in his second term, Roberto Azevedo, the Director General, was approached by a couple of delegations, say, you cannot support these joint statement initiatives, these folks who want to negotiate on e-commerce or other things. And he said, I can do it. It's consistent with the WTO. Why we're here, it's consistent with my mandate. If you want to gather and you have an African group or an Asian group or whatever you want, I support you. I'm going to support these as well. And it was act of a degree of courage and very welcome. What I would do is say, we just did it. They say, oh, but you didn't amend the agreement with a vote on part 4, and say, well, it's here. The GATT Secretariat didn't ever exist. 50 years of non-existence. It was technically the Secretariat to the Interim Committee for the International Trade Organization, which never took place, which never came into being. There was no GATT Secretariat, but people were employed and they did work, and they had 8 successful rounds of major negotiations and no legal basis for it whatsoever for them existing. Maybe the threat of just do it would be enough to bring along some countries to not block.
So your basic advice to WTO members is to do 3 things. Keep what you have, replace what has been lost, and build on the current system to improve it. I think it's clear the replace what you have lost gets to the dispute settlement system, which we will get to. But what are the things that you should keep what you have? I mean, what's essential to keep? What are the things where we should be building on the current system to improve it?
Basically, the system is about constraints on behavior. So, for example, and I'm writing a piece now on food security or food insecurity. The reaction with the closure of the Black Sea has been to cause shockwaves throughout many food importing developing countries as to what's going to happen to their food supply. And it's not just physical supply, because it's largely about price. If India puts on a restriction, as they did on non-basmati rice exports, or the Black Sea is blocked, prices shoot up. Prices shoot up and people go hungry. People go hungry, and actually there's riots in the street, and the Arab Spring is an example of what took place when there's a price spike in developing countries. So that affects developing countries. The rich countries are okay. They are also food insecure, by the way. A major objective of Japan is to increase food self-sufficiency. A major objective of China, which is losing its food self-sufficiency, is to regain food self-sufficiency. The first thing you want to do as a government, if you want to stay in power, is to have food for your people. It's what Franklin Roosevelt called freedom from want, and food was a major element of that. So the developing countries are saying, we want to increase self-sufficiency. What does that do to the environment? How much more fertilizer do you have to use? How much water do you have to pump out of the ground, lowering the water table? Food self-sufficiency is a horrible answer for what trade should be answering, and the WTO has to get to the point where it can address the basic needs of its members through improved trading arrangements.
So let's turn to the issue of dispute settlement. I mean, you've on the one hand argued that really there's a whole lot else going on in the WTO that is in some ways more important. And yet for many of the other members of the WTO, fixing the dispute settlement system is critical. I mean, what they want is, why sign up to new rules if you're not going to be held to account to them? how do we get to a system in which countries feel that they can make commitments and that the smaller countries can hold, if you will, the larger countries. But when you kind of step back from it, for me, the question really is it realistic to think that the United States is going to be willing? It's the United States that's blocking the progress on the dispute settlement system. As you said, the United States is the one that, if you will, broke the system. Is it realistic for the United States to rejoin, if you will, to a binding dispute settlement system? I mean, in many ways, when you step back and look at it, this is one of the issues where the concern is whether we, the United States, are having some kind of buyer's remorse about whether we, in essence, ceded too much sovereignty in the process of creating a binding dispute settlement system. This is, after all, a United States that does not submit to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the Law of the Sea Tribunal, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I mean, we don't do courts. So how is it that we get the United States back into a binding dispute settlement system? I mean, when you look at the votes where they were on the Uruguay round, you look at a lot of members of Congress at the time were saying, I don't really like this binding dispute settlement system. I'm worried about how much sovereignty it's giving away, but I like this agreement on agriculture, or I like this agreement on services, or I like this agreement on intellectual property. So there was a bargain when the dispute settlement system was adopted originally. Now it's not clear to me in this notion of just fixing the system whether there's enough of a bargain to get us to the point where the U.S. will, in fact, agree to a binding dispute settlement system. How do we get there?
I think that there is sufficient value in having a rules-based system that we all live up to, including the United States, that at one level, which is partially theory or it's policy, making sure that countries live up to their obligations is essential. The president of Indonesia said, we just lost a case on, we were condemned for restricting exports of nickel, and so we're appealing to the void so that the warehouse that case. This is spreading. This is 30 cases where countries come and they say, well, we have a notional appeal, a fraudulent appeal, and then that ends that part of the international transaction. So A, stop that, and B, why do we get back? You're right that international negotiations can be of two kinds, really. One is, we'll just do a single subject, and it's self-balancing. We want Indonesia to live up to its obligations and others to live up to their obligations, including the EU, which hit the US, one would say, in a way that was not clearly within the rules with respect to steel and aluminum restrictions. So we want to get back to, let's not all have that sort of mess. And including this administration said, well, yeah, the last administration hit our allies for national security reasons, which we won't say is bunk, but on the other hand, we'll make arrangements so that our allies are less upset over, will liberalize the trade in effect, to back to sort of what it was, at least with our allies. So we try to conform to the system while not quite admitting that we ever violated it. What you raise in your question, which is really a good way of looking at things, is if it's not self-balancing, what else could be on the table? Do we care about rules for e-commerce? Do we care about agricultural market access or limiting subsidies to foreigners being constrained in their domestic support, which means subsidy programs? And we do, actually. You call up USDA and say, do you care about whether all of the rest of the countries of the world can now subsidize to their heart's content to be all self-sufficient in agriculture? They'd say, no, that would ruin domestic agriculture in the United States. We can't have that. So you could have a larger package. And in the earlier rounds, Uruguay, Tokyo round, and the GATT, you put a lot on the table. And my boss, who was Bob Strauss at the time, said, it's like a game of poker. If there's enough in the pot, you can't walk away. So there are those variety of approaches. You either package something with something else, or you say, no, this is in our interest on its own. And I think either path can be taken. These days, there isn't enough on the table. So I suspect it has to be self-balancing. And the self-balancing nature is we want other countries to live up to their obligations. EU is about to come out with CBAM, carbon border adjustment measures. We may not like the way it affects our trade. Others may not like the way it affects their trade. One has to come back to, if there's a dispute, resolution of it, not necessarily litigation. It may be arbitration of some sort. It may be good offices of the Director General. It can be mediation, a variety of possibilities, but we have to have some degree of agreement, again, as to how the system's going to work.
So it's pretty clear to me from discussions I've had in Geneva and with others that if the US is going to come on board on a binding dispute settlement system, sort of with or without a second tier review or an appellate body, there's two issues that are going to have to get resolved in a way that would allow the United States to do that. And the first of them is national security. Again, as you know very well, I mean, for a long, long time, there seemed to be a clear divide between economic security, where all the trade rules and all of us in the trading system played, and a national security lane in which everyone involved on the national security side. That line has been erased, and we now are increasingly seeing this intertwining of national security policy and trade policy. And yet, at the same time, we are seeing the litigation that has occurred at the WTO under the GATS Article 21 exception for security be viewed as a real bone of contention for the United States, where the United States has contended no one has the right to judge whether or not, if I say it's a national security measure, you simply have to take my word for it. You cannot in any way sort of adjudicate a basic claim. How do we get around that? I mean, how do we get around this notion that anyone can declare at any time any measure to have been taken for purposes of national security, and then it's no longer subject to dispute settlement or is not justiciable? What's the fix on national security?
There are three ways forward with respect to dispute settlement to get the United States back on board and a system that applies to all. One is the original problem was trade remedies were constantly narrowed. Their availability was narrowed by the appellate body. So that has to be, there are ways of instructing or constructing a system in which equal weight is given to the rights of countries to restrict trade when there's injury. And that's something this administration should care about. And when the president goes to the picket line, the UAW, he can say, one thing I'm working on is we're going to have an ability to deal with foreign subsidies, which is something you've written about recently. And also, we're going to be able to use mechanisms, measures to offset injurious trade. That's number one. Number two, national security. Where we are today in this country is no one's going to tell us what is national security and what isn't. But the system should be you pay a price if you harm another country's trade. Yes, it's non-justiciable. You claim national security, you can do it, but you will pay a price either in trade compensation to those who are adversely affected, or they can retaliate against you. Not a perfect solution, but is the WTO, the GATS type of solution, a balance of concessions. Third, the US and China are going to have to work out how they're going to handle disputes between the two of them, because they're not going to overnight agree to some binding mechanism in Geneva. The U.S. is no U.S. trade representative is going to come home and say, "I just agreed to binding dispute settlement with China," and Congress would say, well, did you solve all the problems? Is that now we can just live in the same world in the same way? It's politically impossible. There is no J Street in Washington. You may have noticed. John Jay, who negotiated the peace treaty with the United Kingdom to Great Britain, it was not welcome, and he was burned in effigy when he came home. I don't think Catherine Tai is looking forward to being burned in effigy. It's a simple calculation.
I'm going to ask one last question before I turn it over to those in the audience. So if you have questions, please be ready to move to that microphone. So my last question is, when you step back and look at it, a lot of the energy and the focus and the political calculations have gone into regional trade agreements, whether that's the USMCA here, whether that's the RCEP, the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership in Asia, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Japan moved ahead with as the CPTPP. And if you look at trade flows themselves, they're also becoming much more regional. So if globalization is going regional, what's left for the WTO?
Well, first of all, all of these agreements are based on the WTO rule book. So as Dr. Ngozi said last week, 75% of trade is still based upon the tariffs set in the schedules in the WTO, but 98% is based on the rules other than the tariff obligations. So you need that basis. I see regional trade agreements as being laboratories for the improvement in the global system. CPTPP, Comprehensive Partnership for Trans-Pacific, that's one. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is I think very important, and the WTO's pledge to support it is really essential. They must not become a substitute fragmentation of the system, but they should be a way of finding ways forward on key subjects among those who can agree. And they're not all regional. I mean, the UK joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, hardly very regional. So it's a way forward. Those who aren't enamored of the multilateral trading system, and there are some countries that are not fostering its progress, should look around and see others are going to move forward one way or another in the organization or outside of it.
So I'm going to look quickly and see if there are any questions from those here before Adam tells me we're out of time. Oh,